Hello and welcome to the Money Street. Today we are going to talk about one of the worst situations that an economy can go through and which we will almost inevitably enter in the coming months unless there is a surprise. A situation that will affect us all and threatens the world with a major crisis not seen since 2008. Today we are going to talk about stagflation. What is stagflation, how we have come to be so threatened by it, and, above all, what can we do in the face of such a scenario? Normally the economy has two natural states, one in which the GDP grows, that is, in which the economy grows, and the unemployment rate decreases. In this case inflation appears simply because there is more money in the economy. There is also the opposite situation, in which the economy decreases, then it goes into recession and unemployment increases. In such cases, prices tend to fall because people and companies generally have less money. However, at very specific moments in history there has been a curious situation which unites the bad of both worlds. A constant rise in prices while the economy is in recession and unemployment is rising. You may wonder how this is possible. Let's look at an example. It was the 1970s and the capitalism was booming. Economies like the USA or the UK had been growing at a dizzying pace for many years. New modern household appliances and millions of cars were arriving in many homes. Companies were making higher and higher profits, and everything was going full steam ahead. To fuel this economic growth, central banks had low interest rates. This means that debt was very cheap, which encouraged families to spend and buy better houses, cars, household appliances, go on vacation, etc. At the same time, it also meant that companies invested in new factories, machinery, more employees and everything necessary for their businesses to grow. However, a long-distant war was to put an end to all that in 1973. An Arab coalition composed of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel to recapture the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Arab forces, well backed by Soviet Union money and armaments, and with the help of expeditionary forces from a lot of Muslim countries, had nothing to do against Israel, which was financed by the USA. In retaliation to this Western aid to Israel, the newly created OPEC, composed of many oil-producing countries which were mostly Muslim countries, carried out an oil embargo on the West and reduced their oil production to the maximum. This caused an increase in the price of oil never seen before. The situation caused a fuel shortage in the USA. Many factories had to stop their production totally or partially and therefore had to lay off workers. This sudden halt in production caused a slowdown in the US economy and unemployment rose as oil prices continued to rise, creating inflation. In the USA, restrictions on refueling were applied, and if the license plate ended in an odd number you could only refuel on odd days, and the same, if you had a license plate ending in an even number, you could only refuel on even days. Speed limits were also reduced, and even competitions such as the Monte Carlo Rally were suspended. At that time, anything went in order to reduce the demand for oil. But even so, the crisis hit hard and pushed millions of people into poverty. In short, an increase in the price of oil caused by a war triggered a sharp rise in prices, which led to an economic crisis on which the central banks were slow to act. If you are enjoying this video and want to be aware of new videos, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This situation we have discussed is somewhat similar to what we are currently experiencing, and some of you may be wondering why this does not happen whenever there is inflation. The answer is simple. Normally inflation is produced by an increase in demand. This means that families or companies have more money and therefore demand more goods and services, which raises their prices. However, in stagflation scenarios, what normally causes prices to rise is not an increase in demand, but a problem with supply. Basically what happened was that the rise in oil prices caused a huge increase in costs. These costs were passed on by the companies to the customer, raising prices. However, customers, who had the same money, simply stopped buying. In other words, they reduced their consumption. This reduction in consumption led to a reduction in production in companies, which as a consequence had to lay off some of their workers. This is how inflation and unemployment began to coexist. As we were saying, we are currently facing a similar scenario, although with certain differences. It is true that very specific events, such as the recent confinements in China by COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine, have led to a situation similar to that of the 1970s, in which supply has been reduced, creating bottlenecks in the global supply chain and causing inflation. However, not all inflation is coming from there. In this case, part of the inflation has been carried over from the COVID-19 crisis. To alleviate the effects of the economic standstill caused by the confinements and the anti-COVID measures, governments such as the US or the European Union itself printed huge amounts of money so that the economy would not enter into a super recession. We are experiencing the problem of printing so much money now in the form of rising prices. Having made this analysis, the only thing left to ask ourselves is how to put an end to stagflation. The first indispensable and most important step is to put an end to inflation, and once we have put an end to this price increase, to tackle economic growth. How do we put an end to inflation? Well, we have two ways to do it. The first is to raise interest rates to end inflation, which is the result of uncontrolled money printing. What does it mean to raise interest rates? Basically, central banks lend money to commercial banks at a higher interest rate. By financing themselves at a higher interest rate, commercial banks also lend money to families and companies at a higher interest rate, so people get into less debt, since borrowing money is more expensive. In this way, consumption goes down, because people go on vacation less, buy less houses, less cars and so on, and the same happens with companies, which invest less in technology, machinery, new factories, etc. This puts the brakes on the economy. The problem is that, if the central banks do not get the intensity of this slowdown right, they can overshoot the brakes and cause a major recession in the economy, and therefore a major crisis. The other thing that must be done to put an end to inflation is to put an end to the bottlenecks that make international trade more expensive and, above all, to the rise in commodity prices. In the current situation, this means ending the Ukrainian conflict, or at least the sanctions against Russia. Pressure can also be put on oil-producing countries to produce more crude oil so that the price of crude oil will fall. We can also improve oil refining capacity or encourage oil-producing companies to look for new oil fields, or even in the long term we can promote renewable energies, among other things. The objective is clear: to increase the supply of energy to lower its price, and if the producers of raw materials, especially gas and oil, refuse to produce more, and the West does not find a way to seek alternative energy sources, you will wonder what could be done in that case. Well, in that case the best thing to do is to reduce demand. On the other hand, it should be said that this would also slow down the economy. How do you curb demand? Well, by establishing restrictions on everything that uses energy, for example, the circulation of cars. It could also be interesting for the state to encourage companies to optimize their production processes to make them more energy efficient, i.e., taking advantage of current technology, companies can produce the same using less energy or renewable energies. The problem with this is that both increasing the supply of gas and oil and reducing demand, or even finding alternatives, takes time, a long time, and in any case, once inflation is under control, the only thing left to do is to stimulate the economy again by lowering interest rates and returning to an economic situation of growth and prosperity. Thanks for watching the Money Street, and don't forget to click the subscribe button for more financial videos.